report, Comprehensive Annual Financial Report. It's a CAFR, is what we typically call it. It's really the results of your budget. How did you do? So in order to really understand both the budget and then the CAFR, you kind of need to understand where a lot of that information comes from, or where really those funds sit. Now, when you think of a fund, you can think of a company, essentially. And in a company, such as even AGH, we really are responsible for, say, a return on investment or the bottom line. You, as elected officials, are responsible for stewardship of funds, compliance with the rules and regulations that are governing a lot of the revenues you receive, whether it's grant or even money with little money left over from the state. There's still regulations surrounding a lot of that. Now, these regulations set these funds up in, they aggregate them in like regulations or like compliance issues. So when you think about that, we really think about governmental funds, proprietary funds, or fiduciary funds. The last piece you guys don't have, so I won't go through that. There are 11 types, company types. I won't go through all those because you don't have them all. And we'll be brief about the 3 fund categories that these things fit into. So my presentation is really centered around the bottom 3 bullets: governmental funds, proprietary funds, and fiduciary funds. When you think about governmental funds, you guys hear this all the time, having gone through the budget, the general fund, special revenue funds, debt service, and then capital projects. When you think about the general fund, that's really the chief operating fund. Within the city of Gardner, you guys have community development, city administration, you've got finance, public works, police, and parks within that fund. So a lot of those operations go into this pot, or this company, if you will. And then there's other regulations and requirements around that. Generally accepted accounting principles requires, when you look at fund balance, which is a common topic for governments, it's broken out into the type of fund balance. And when we come back at the end of our audit, we'll kind of walk you through some of those categories to let you know where you stand and what that looks like compared to last year. Then there's all kind of legal requirements, and there's more created every legislative session that goes through in the general fund as well. But in essence, the general fund is really used to account for all the financial resources except for those that are required to be counted for someplace else. Starting with the special revenue funds, these are really just legally restricted within, especially state statute in Kansas. They're legally restricted, either external legal restrictions such as grants or enabling legislation. You may have a park sales tax that comes through. It has to be required. It's required to be in that fund itself. That'd be internal legal restrictions and earmarks. For City of Gardner, obviously, you know, economic development is a example of a local restriction. Special alcohol and drug money, which I hope sticks around this year. Administrative benefit fee, which is a great one, but it's also legal, or a local. One of the state restrictions is your law enforcement trust funds. When you look at debt service funds, these are really used to account for any of the bond payments, and these are general obligation bonds. You have general obligation bonds, and then those that are backed by utilities. This is where you find those payments coming through. So that company essentially just pays for those bond payments. It is required under the state of Kansas to have, at least to maintain those payments. The next one is the capital projects fund. When you issue bonds on the GO bonds, this is where the proceeds go in order to fund the capital projects that you've issued the money for. In my past life as a finance director, I often found even directors coming to me and say, hey, can I use this bond proceed for something else if I'm not going to use it here? There are restrictions there that says you can't. When you issue a bond, and you can talk to your financial advisor and bond attorney, he'll tell you more, but once you issue those bonds, they're really dedicated exclusively for those purposes, almost down to the street if it's in the ordinance. So there are major restrictions within this fund that exist. Enterprise fund and internal service, these are proprietary. This is the most like a business you can get in government. Enterprise funds have an external focus Internal service funds have an internal focus, as you might suspect. Enterprise funds for Gardner water, sewer, electric. We see stormwater happening more and more all the time because it's a bigger and bigger issue. Fees start being generated. A lot of the times on enterprise funds, you'll find entities wanting to put something like a stormwater in an enterprise fund to really draw out what the subsidy from another fund might look like. So public, you pay this fee, we have to subsidize it with the general fund using this fee. You can still create an enterprise fund doing that for that purpose. It's required if those last three bullets are in place. And we see that with parks funds sometimes. Parks bonds just exclusively dedicated, or the bonds are paid for by the fees coming out of that parks requirement. Legal requirements to cover full costs using fees and not subsidies. And then just basically a policy decision to recover those full costs. And I've seen the argument whether, say, a Parks and Recreation Fund or even a community center might be an enterprise fund versus a special revenue fund. You know, it could go either way. It really comes down to what do you expect to see out of your financials. And they have two largely different issues. Now, on the other enterprise funds, the other thing that surprised me when I entered government 15 years ago is how important these utilities, and at least the control of those utilities, played in economic development. I would have never thought that until I got the Unified Government, both Unified Government and Olathe. They have won and lost developments based on where the utilities were. Everything else is fantastic, but you don't have utilities there, so why would I come down here? We lost, in Olathe, we lost, what is it, 500,000 square foot building to Phoenix because we couldn't get water to the site fast enough.
Wow.
Well, and I can only imagine if you look at the unified government, the electric and water goes to another entity. When I was up there, we had to have not just the Unified Government Commission agree to it, but we also had to have the Board of Public Utilities on board. A whole nother level of bureaucracy we had to get with. Turns out it worked out because now you got the speedway out there with all the retail that's developed. But dealing with two different boards can be somewhat arduous. You don't have the ability to make that unilateral decision and just play a part of it, along with everything else that you can suspect. But that one was one that kind of surprised me. But I think it's prevalent throughout anybody that's got a utility fund, is the exclusive control they have, or the ability for them to make that decision on where that capital might go. Internal service funds, again, internally based. Within the City of Gardner, I believe it's IT, the Building Maintenance Fund, you've got fleet, risk management, and utility billing is those items in the internal service funds. Now, I told you I wasn't going to make you an accountant, and that's the end of my presentation for accounting. And I got to tell you, you've got fantastic folks here, and Laura and Jackie and her staff, in order to do what they need to do on a regular basis. So trusting in them is a fantastic thing to do because this can be overwhelming for some of the folks we hire right out of school because they're not trained on this on a regular basis. Now, it does tie into, obviously, best practices on budgeting. One of the reasons I jumped at the chance when both Cheryl and Laura asked me to come down and talk about this, typically you don't find auditors talking about budget. That's a very, very little piece of our program. But having lived the last 15 years in both line item budgeting and outcome-based budgeting, I saw more benefit once entities that I worked with, not just the two I worked with, but others throughout the U.S., when they converted to that outcome-based budgeting, the discussions became strategic. They became, outcomes-based. The directors had a lot more say in how they're going to achieve your goals, essentially. And instead of getting down into the weeds that these other entities did, what they really came down to is that last bullet there, strategic planning to outcomes. Where they played the role was, how are you going to get me? And this is your sentence. How are you going to get me to the goal that I just set for you? Or for the community, not for you, but for the community. What's the easiest, most efficient way of getting there? And that's really budgeting for outcomes, strategic planning to outcomes. Now, budgeting has, obviously, they share a role within private sector. Private sector is a financial planning tool. Not a lot of people look at a budget on a company. It's